Hey makers, welcome back to creating your own journal. If you didn't see part one, you'll want to make these pieces first. We are going to use wax, a tapestry needle, and bookbinding thread. And if you don't have regular bookbinding thread, you can use any thread, but you'll want to make sure it's a heavier weight thread, like a crafting thread. We need to put the holes in our covers because we haven't done that yet. So what I'm going to do is use one of my signatures and these holes that we did in our signatures to mark the holes in my cover. So I'm just going to figure out which side is my binding side. Once you've decided which part is your front and your back and your top and your bottom, because I'm using hand painted paper, there's no pieces of the paper that are the same. They're all different. And so I just have to kind of look them over and decide which one's going to be top, which one's going to be bottom, and which way it's going to face and all that jazz. So when I figure out how I want my binding edge to be, then I'm going to line it up with that binding edge, and I'm going to look at the holes that I've put in my signatures and use those to line up the holes on my cover. Remember that we had a little bit of space to the right and the left. So I'm using my triangle again, and I'm just lining that up with my signature, and then using a white pen. In my case, I'm using a white gel pen. Depending on the color of your cover, you could use white or you could use black. And you're just going to make a dot where the holes go. They just need to be visible. They don't need to be really large, but you do need to be able to see where they're at so they're accurate. And then I'm going to get out my book awl, and I'm going to go ahead and remember I lean it sideways just to line the tip up with the hole, and then I bring it up and I do a slight pressure with twist. And especially with the cardboard or chipboard, you have to apply more pressure. So I lay it down, line it up on the hole, and then I lift up. If I try to just stab straight down without lining it up, I could get it off, and I like it to be accurate. So this is just my way of getting it accurate, making sure that point is on the dot that I put on the cover. Then I go back through, because again, remember, an awl is tapered, so your hole can be very small in diameter, or by going through a little bit further, you can make the hole a little bit wider in diameter. And remember, the awl is very sharp and it will bite, so make sure your fingers are out of the way as you're doing this. But basically, once you've put your holes and you can see them on both sides, you're going to want to take that awl and you're going to want to make those holes just a little bit bigger, because you're going to be going through that hole multiple times, and you want to make sure that all the threads will pull through there easily. And then what I did was, the cover that was already done, I lined it up, and then I went through to mark my second set of holes. And rather than doing it with my signature, this makes sure that my two covers will line up accurately, because I'm going to use the same exact holes that I did in the top cover to line up the bottom cover. Now that I can see those, I'll go ahead and go through again. If I can't find the hole on the other side, all I have to do is poke through from the back a little bit more. And once I get that through there and can see where my hole is, then I do like to go through the front, because the front is the part you're going to see. And I like that paper cover to be pushed down into the cardboard. If I only push from the back side of the cover, then it actually tends to lift the front cover of the paper up and push the edges of the paper up around that hole. So by going back through the front, I'm pushing the paper down into the hole so that it does not show on top. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and just get all those holes ready, and then we're going to be ready to go ahead and start binding all our pieces together. Again, if you missed video 1 where we made our pages, signatures, and learned how to cover, to make a cover, to cover the board, to make a cover, you might want to go back and watch video 1. So here's our signatures that we made in the first video. And I'm just going to stack these and then set them off to the side, because we're only going to work with one signature at a time. Okay, when you measure your binding thread, you're going to take your number of signatures plus your cover. So I have 4 signatures and my cover, which equals 5. I'm going to take that number when I measure the length of my binding thread I want it to be a minimum of 5, and usually you want to go more. So what I'm doing is I'm giving myself a little extra on each end. If you notice how I'm holding extra on the left and the right, I'm giving myself extra. I believe on this one I counted out 5, but I did give myself extra string left and right. It's always safer to go more so you don't have to have another knot in the middle of your book. So I would say go 6, especially your first time. Always add an extra length on there. And then what I did was I doubled my thread up before I cut it, because I'm going to be binding with double thread. You can bind with single thread or you can bind with double thread. That is totally up to you. The double thread for this bookbinding thread is very thin, so I like doubling, and it also keeps it from coming out of my needle because I don't have that tail sticking out of the eye of my needle. So I'm going to wax this thread because it is not waxed and it is thin. If you use a heavy sewing thread or a craft thread, and you have some paraffin wax or some beeswax, you might want to go ahead and just pull it through. And all I do is lay the string on, put my thumb on it, and then pull the string across the wax. Waxing will help your thread to slide easier through your pages as you're binding. It will also help it to knot and to stick to itself when you knot it so that your binding stays tighter. You do not have to use wax thread. It's a preference, and some people do and some people don't. And if you haven't done bookbinding before, you can purchase bookbinding thread that either comes waxed or unwaxed, and you can buy it in different thicknesses and you can buy it in different colors. But you can also do your own, and my last little journal I bound with some heavy yarn, and it was a bit of a challenge, but you can use all kinds of things to bind your books. So once I threaded it, I just double knotted the end of my thread, and then I made sure that it was nice and straight. The hardest part of bookbinding is getting started because number 1, you're dealing with a lot of thread at the beginning, and number 2, you're trying to attach your cover. So that makes it a bit tricky. Doesn't matter if you start on the left or the right, but you're going to start from the inside of your first signature. And you're going to just pull that through. Make sure that your knot is secure. If it feels like your knot is going to pull out, then you might want to pull back on your knot and add another knot on top of it just to make it a little bit thicker. Once you've pulled it through, you're going to go from the outside of the cover towards the inside of the cover so that it loops around that outside edge. And then as you're pulling that loop, you want to get the edge of that first signature nice and flush with the outside edge of your cover. So even though the loop will come in inset a little bit, you want to make sure that that signature is all the way flush with the edge. And then you're just going to hold it down with your fingers and you're going to pull that through, and you're going to make sure it's nice and snug. Then you're going to take your needle and go under the loop that you just made. And when you're pulling thread for bookbinding, I like to lay my needle down and grab my thread with my hand and pull it through carefully so that I don't get knots, because the worst thing that can happen is you get your thread knotted up and then you have to figure out how to tie new thread on, or you have to start over. And I would just rather go slow. So especially if you're just starting, take your time and go slow. And then once you've made that loop, you go back in through the same hole on your signature and just make sure that it goes through all the pages. So in this case, I have 3 pages make a signature. So then you're going to pull that back through. You're going to make sure that that's snug. When you pull on threads as you're bookbinding, you do want to make sure that you pull your thread the direction of the spine. I'm just checking my loop here to make sure that I don't have any excess. Always check each step along the way to make sure that you didn't get some excess thread that did not pull through. Because that's another frustrating thing, is if you get several stitches in and then you look back and go, oh my goodness, I had a snag and now there's this big loop of thread. If you check each one as you go and take your time, you'll be happier in the end. So right here, I had one thread that pulled through faster than the other, so I just had to go back and pull that through. And it should lay nice and flat inside that signature, okay, just like that. You want it to just lay nice and flat. And then on the outside, I'm going to do the same thing that I did the first time, is that I'm going to take that from the outside of the cover towards the inside. Now, this is the tricky part because you're trying to keep that first signature from not getting sloppy, but you're also trying to get that needle through. And coming through that first cover is tricky. So I let it move over a little bit, but then what I'm going to do is line it back up, and I'm going to make sure that that's snug before I go back in again. I have to loop around, always loop around, okay? So the process is you come out from the inside, you make your loop, and then you go back through the same hole to the inside again, okay? So getting the needle between the cover and the first signature is the hardest part, and so just do the best you can and get it pulled through there. Make that little loop, and when you're pulling your thread tight, you notice that I am pulling in the direction of my spine. If I pull out towards my body, then I have a chance of ripping the paper. So you never want to pull your thread towards you. You want to always pull your thread in the direction of the spine. You can see there I laid it down in the direction of the spine. Back out through the next hole. Again, I like to lay my needle down so that I can get control of my thread and pull that through to make sure that it lays nice and flat and that I don't have any snags or any loops anywhere. And then on the outside, I have to go through behind that thread and make a loop again. Once I go through the cover, it's a little trickier this time because as you're getting closer to the end, it gets tighter and it's much harder to get your needle through. So you just have to be careful and kind of wiggle between the cover and the signature. And you'll notice when I get to the very last one, I open the signature up so that I can actually access my needle, because by the time you get to that last corner, the last hole, you're not going to be able to move that signature out of your way. So you have to fold it over like you're opening the book. Stuck my finger in the loop there. That's another way that I control the thread so that it doesn't get tangled up. Lay it down, make sure it's nice and lined up. And then you're going to make your loop around the loop that you just did. Sorry, I get off camera a bit. It's very hard to teach bookbinding on a video. A lot of times when you do bookbinding, you keep those laying flat on your table, and I'm just trying to show everything on camera so that you guys can see the technique, so it's a little bit tricky. Go ahead and make your loop again. So putting your cover on, you're looping through the cover. Then you're making a loop around the first loop that you made, which is what's going to secure your signature. And then you go back into the hole on the signature until you take the thread back into the middle. And that's what I'm doing here. So I came out, went through the cover, made a loop around the first loop, and then back into the middle of the signature again. And just take your time. You've got so much thread that's the most frustrating thing at the beginning, is you're dealing with so much thread and you're trying to get through a hard cover. And so just do the best you can. And then this is the last one to get this cover attached. So I'm going to go back out through the hole. And sometimes if you wiggle your pages too much, the holes that you put in your signatures will slip just a little bit. So just don't try to poke through paper if it doesn't want to go through, because you'll create another hole. Just take your time and stop and get that needle, make sure it's going through the actual hole that you created. That can happen a lot when you're new to bookbinding. You've created holes, but then you go to try and put it through, the needle won't go, and then you force it, and then you've created another hole in your paper, and you don't want to do that. Again, you're going from the outside of the cover to the inside. Got to do a little wiggle to get it through the cardboard, and then pull that thread through until it's nice and snug. And now is where I can't really just push my needle through there So I'm gonna go from the inside of the book, and I see how I fold my page over because it's pretty solid now on my cover. So I can kind of fold it over, pull my needle through to make a loop around that thread that I just came out, and I'm gonna make a loop there. So I have to go back through and come out to make the loop around the one that attached it and make sure it doesn't get snagged. And then we don't go back in the last hole. Okay, when you get to the end and the first signature's done, you lay the second signature on top. And instead of going back in the hole of the first signature, you go into the hole on the second signature. And then you just start repeating. So I've pulled it through, and then I go out through the second hole. And we're repeating the whole process that we just did with the first signature. The only difference is when we come out this time, we're going to go and loop between the first signature and the cover. We're going to create a loop. And each time we add a new signature, we step up from there. So right now I'm going through the cover, and the first signature is where I'm looping my thread. When I get to the third signature, I will loop my thread between the first and the second signature. Okay? When I get to my fourth signature, I will loop my thread between my second and third signature. So you're always making that loop in between the previous stack that you just bound. And that little loop is what really creates the sturdy binding, and that's what creates that pretty little design that you see when you look at the edge of the binding. Okay, so just continue in this process until you get to the very last signature. When you get to this last signature, you're going to attach the signature and the cover at the same time. And again, now we're back to a tricky part. Now, some people like to go ahead and completely attach their first signature and then attach their cover. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. If you do that, then you will have 2 lines of thread inside your final signature instead of 1 line of thread, because you actually have to go through the process twice. If you attach your last signature and your final cover at the same time together, then you're just going to go through the process once. I hope that makes sense. So again, we're doing the same thing where you came through the cover on the outside, make a loop, come around the loop that you just created, and then go into the hole on the signature. So this final step, we're putting the loop around the cover first, and then we're making our loop around the thread, and then we're going into the signature. And then after that, you're just completing the process just like we did at the very beginning. You know, you loop through the cover, go into the signature, come out the signature, until you get to the end. All right, so you're repeating the process, always looping around the cover, looping around the loop, back into the signature, and then go to the next hole. And you're repeating that whole process. And then when you get on that last hole, that's when you will finally go ahead and finish off your knot. On this final one, you're going to loop around. After you've done your final loop, you're going to come back and you're going to loop it around one last time before you go back into the last signature, just to make sure that that has a nice loop on the end of it. And then once you pull it through to the inside, you're going to make your knot. I like to check my spine, make sure everything looks good and I don't have any loops anywhere, and then go under, go back through, just a basic knot, pull down, same direction as your spine goes. Never pull out to the side because you could rip your paper. I like to knot it twice just for good measure. And then when I trim it, be sure that you don't trim it too close to the knot. I think about a 1/4 inch is good. Then I took a bone folder and just opened up those signatures there and pressed them down just to give some more flatness to my book. Since it's a fresh fold in the paper, it wants to kind of open up. And you can use the handle of your scissors or anything that's smooth that you can just kind of press down on those folds and make them lay nice and flat. After that, all you have to do, if you want to, is decorate your cover. If you want to add an embellishment of some kind, you don't have to add an embellishment if you don't want to, but some people like to add a little extra on the outside. Some people like to put a closure on their journal, and there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You could do it with a loop and button. You can take something like a little strip of fabric and just wrap it around there and have a tie closure. That could be glued on with hot glue, or you could even leave it loose. Whatever you want to do is perfectly fine. You can leave the book just like it is. You don't have to put a closure on it. I hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial on bookbinding. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do subscribe. And don't forget to press that like button, and I'll see you next time.